Hey guys, it's Sam. Just wanted to do a quick video response to Jeff from Encounterbalance. He did a bit of a video response to a couple of my videos, which I think was really good. I think he made a lot of really good points there. I will make sure to go ahead and link that video in the description below. Sorry, I haven't done that ahead of time, but I wanted to make sure I got this video in while I had some time. It was kind of responding to some of the questions that I had regarding 5th edition and the mechanics and the intent behind the game, whether you should play it a certain way and whether it supports a narrative style of game or not. And I think Jeff made some really excellent points there. But there was a couple of things that he said, and I'm going to paraphrase them. And if I get the wording or the intent wrong, please correct me. But there was a couple of points in the video that I wanted to talk about that I thought were interesting, and that maybe I have a little bit of a different perspective on. But I also want to say that none of the points that I'm making right now should be interpreted as like hard and fast facts or that these are my set opinion. More so that I want to kind of spur discussion and see what other people think, because as you guys know, I'm kind of going through a bit of a system exploration or discovery. And so I'm looking for opinions and whatever on these things. So Jeff had made a point that, well, the reason that 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons has the most effort or time or word count or whatever spent on combat resolution mechanics is because it is the part of the game that needs the most mechanics to keep it balanced and fair and whatever. But I don't know that I would disagree unless you are designing the game specifically with the intent of having the main system be combat, and you want a robust rules system there to support that. If the design intent is to have the central focus of your game be on combat, then absolutely. But I would suggest that you take a look at Dungeon World, because in Dungeon World, combat is basically you roll your 2d6. If you're attacking with a melee weapon, you're basically rolling hack and slash, which is the move on the playbook. And if you're not familiar with those terms, go take a look at Dungeon World. It's a really good system. If you succeed, you succeed. You deal damage, it's hit points, whatever. If you get a 7 through 9, you succeed, but there's some sort of complication. And if you fail on a 6 or lower, you don't usually succeed, but chances are something bad is going to happen to you. And that's about it. There's very little rules when it comes to combat. Furthermore, that system is not designed with the intent that you gain experience points or level up based on defeating monsters, right? So that to me, again, speaks to design intent. That I don't know, that like if you are designing the game that way, then that's okay, right? So to say that combat by necessity needs more rules, I don't know, especially if you're operating under the premise that in a narrative game, the players and their descriptions are the most important, right? So I thought that was interesting. It's sort of an interesting take. In fact, the thing that I love the most about Dungeon World is the combat system. It's brilliant and it's super cinematic. And it's because of the lack of defined combat rules that I think that works. I have a Dungeon World actual play on my channel. I might try to link that in the video here as well, so you guys can take a look and see how that system works. But it works really well. And then the other thing I wanted to address really quick was I had made suggestions that Dungeons & Dragons wasn't necessarily designed with mechanics to help support things like exploration and social intrigue and political intrigue and stuff like that. And Jeff kind of suggested that, well, you don't really need those things, right? That those are more about the story that the GM tells. And that, in fact, if you add mechanics to the game for those things, that might take away from that. So to respond to that, I would say, well, one, go ahead and check Dungeon World again, because Dungeon World does have exploration mechanics. And again, I think they're done really well. Primarily in Perilous Wilds, which is a supplement to Dungeon World. That's really cool. Also, the 5th edition, I can't remember if it's in the Adventures in Middle-earth Player's Guide or Lore Master's Guide, but it's got travel rules, right? And I believe in the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition, there's a little bit there as well. But here's the thing, right? To say that it doesn't have mechanics for those systems, I don't think is accurate. It does. It has skills, right? It has survival for your travel and your wilderness stuff, right? I mean, that's a primary skill for that. I would say even athletics, maybe. And then any of your social skills, something like... and it doesn't, I can't remember what the skill is called in 5th edition, but any of your sort of charisma-based skills, anytime you need to make a charisma check, if there's a skill, if there's a mechanic, what that is saying, the design intent behind that is to say, there is a rule here. It's basically a skip button, right? So, for example, if you want to do if you want to do exploration in Dungeons and Dragons in the 5th edition. So the older systems had a little bit more refined rules, and I don't know that I necessarily like them, but in 5th edition, the suggestion is you skip over wilderness travel. You montage it. If there's anything important, you roll a survival check. And depending on how that goes, might determine whether you get lost or whatever. Now, they took out the mechanics, for sure, of things like random wilderness encounters and stuff like that. I believe they put those in the DMG, but they do have mechanics for it. And then in terms of social encounters, again, all of the social skills, or the idea that you could use charisma and make a roll to, persuasion. I mean, persuasion, to me, there should not be a persuasion skill. Now, I understand this is just my opinion, and it's not one that I think a lot of people hold. I think a lot of people have said, well, I'm not as eloquent as my character. I'm not as whatever, like my character isn't me, and so therefore they might be better at persuasion or diplomacy or whatever than I am. And I get that. But what I would say is you don't need a skill for that. What you need is a dungeon master or a game master who's understanding of that fact and basically will say to you, okay, you make your best attempt at this. Like, you kind of tell me what you think makes sense. Like, you don't have to use all the right words, but let's role play it out. And the GM can make a determination, based on your role play as to whether or not he thinks that makes sense. If you still need a roll, if there's any sort of chance that you're going to fail, then you can still roll, right? You can still make a roll, but maybe the role play that you did in the beginning would give you a bonus, So there are mechanics if you want to use them. But by having a skill like persuasion or diplomacy, what that does, the design intent behind that, is that those are there to help you skip over that part of the game, right? Because you don't need to role play it out. What it's saying is, you've got a skill here, just roll your skill against a predetermined difficulty level or rating, and if you succeed, then you are successful. And yes, you could role play that out, but what's going to happen is as soon as you roll dice, that will be superficial at best. You will have maybe a small exchange, right? So the design intent is skip the talking parts, right? Skip the exploration parts, go to the combat. That's how the system largely is designed. Now, again, this is all caveated with, you can play the game however you want to play it, right? I mean, and Jeff's right in the sense that the game is made different at each table by how you play it. But what I'm trying to kind of understand and decide is, what is the design intent behind the rules of these games, you know? And to me, the newer editions of Dungeons and Dragons, the intent that I perceive, rightly or wrongly, is that exploration and social mechanics, political intrigue or whatever, those are filler. Those are things to be skipped or superficially touched on, right? And that combat, because it has the most rules, is what's important. And because your character advances and grows and becomes better through your ability to defeat monsters, that combat is the most important part. And I don't even think the combat mechanic is that great in any edition of D&D, because I think it's slow and the turn-based combat is weird for me. But yeah, but you know, then again, I have issues with that in some of the other games I play as well. So I don't know. So I mean, what do you guys think? Because especially with the idea of the, you know, social skills and, you know, something like survival as a skip button for those aspects of the game. Do you think that's wrong? You know, does that make sense to you? You know, let me know. And also in terms of the combat mechanic and needing rules to help define that more, because by definition, combat sort of requires more rules to help keep it fair and balanced and defined. Do you think that is true? Do you think that's necessary? Do you think that my explanation of the way Dungeon World does it is a counterpoint to that or not? So I would love it if we could keep the conversation alive, whether that's through comments, whether that's through video responses or whatever. You know, so love to hear from you. Happy gaming.